Of all the names that should never have made a police blotter, Letitia James was at the top of the list. New York's Attorney General, a household name, a courtroom warrior feared by billionaires, corrupt politicians, and corporate lawyers alike. But on a brutally hot Saturday afternoon, dressed in nothing more than jeans, sneakers, and a white t-shirt, Letitia James was not holding a subpoena or giving a press conference. She was driving her blue sedan down a quiet residential block in Brooklyn to pick up groceries and maybe stop by an old friend's apartment, until a police siren ripped through the silence like a warning shot from a broken system. This isn't a story about mistaken identity. It's a story about erased identity, about what happens when a badge sees melanin before credentials. And before you settle into your chair thinking this is just another headline in a long list of police encounters gone wrong, pause. Because this one didn't happen in the shadows. This wasn't some ambiguous footage filmed on a shaky cell phone. Number. This happened in broad daylight, and the woman lying in a pool of her own blood wasn't resisting arrest, wasn't running, wasn't armed. She was standing still, hands up, asking a question, and she got shot for it. The street was still when it happened, the kind of summer afternoon where even the air seems to hold its breath. A few kids riding bikes had turned the corner. A dog barked behind a chain-link fence. A lawn sprinkler clicked rhythmically nearby. And then, sirens, screeching brakes. A blue sedan slowed, obediently pulling over to the curb without hesitation. Inside was Letitia, civilian, unarmed, alone. The squad car parked aggressively behind her, tires spitting gravel. Two officers stepped out. The first, Rob Pulaski, a red-faced man in his 40s, the kind of cop who wore his hostility like a badge of honor. His hand hovered over his holstered Glock like it had a mind of its own. The second, Kevin Chen, was younger, unsure, a fresh recruit still trying to find his place in a department where silence ranked higher than justice. "Out of the car! Hands where I can see them!" Pulaski barked before she'd even reached for her door handle. Letitia complied without question, stepping out calmly. Her palms faced the sky. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't confrontational either. "Excuse me, officer," she said in that unmistakable measured voice, firm, respectful, not the least bit afraid. "Is there a reason I'm being stopped?" It was the tone of a woman used to holding people accountable. Pulaski didn't answer. His eyes scanned her, not for danger, but for justification. For something, anything, to confirm the prejudice already boiling in his bloodstream. Letitia didn't twitch, didn't fidget. She stood like a statue of reason in front of a man looking for an excuse. And then he gave himself one. There was no warning, no escalation, just movement. Pulaski drew his weapon, extended his arm, and fired once, dead center. The shot cracked through the neighborhood like a firework made of bone and blood. Letitia collapsed. Her knees hit the asphalt first, then her hand, then her head. She let out a sound, short and sharp, more breath than scream. The pristine white t-shirt she wore darkened rapidly as a red bloom spread across her side. Her body folded, and for a second, time seemed to do the same. Kevin Chen froze. He didn't draw, didn't speak, didn't even move. He just stood there, mouth slightly open, watching a senior officer shoot an unarmed black woman for... what? Asking a question? Pulaski lowered his gun slowly, like even he wasn't sure what had just happened. His breathing was erratic, not from fear, but fury. Fury that she'd looked him in the eye. Fury that she hadn't trembled. Fury that she'd dared to ask why. This wasn't police work. This was fragility in uniform. From behind the curtains of nearby homes, witnesses began to appear. Some called 911. Others just stared, trying to register what they'd seen. A woman had asked a question, and the response had been a bullet. There was no weapon on Letitia, no aggressive move, no suspicious behavior, just a calm, clear demand for explanation, and a racist man's panic disguised as protocol. Before this day, Letitia James had taken on Wall Street. She had battled the opioid industry. She had faced off against governors, real estate giants, and systemic injustice. But what she hadn't prepared for, what she shouldn't have to prepare for, was becoming a statistic on the same street she grew up walking as a child. This is where the story begins. Not in a courtroom, not in a protest, but right here, on a sun-scorched piece of New York pavement, where a woman, one of the most powerful legal figures in the state, was treated like a threat for existing in the wrong skin. And if that doesn't make you question everything you think you know about justice in America, you're not paying attention. The bullet entered just below her ribs, left side, a precise shot, if you were aiming for cruelty. Letitia James crumpled slowly, like a woman refusing to give her dignity over to gravity. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She bit down hard and let the pain ride through her, her white shirt blossoming into red as if protesting the absurdity of it all. One moment, New York's highest-ranking law enforcement officer was upright and questioning a traffic stop. The next, she was on her knees, bleeding on the same pavement where a decade ago she'd cut the ribbon on a community justice initiative. Irony doesn't get darker than that. Kevin Chen stood frozen, not stiff with discipline, paralyzed with disbelief. His mouth hung open in some failed attempt at speech, eyes darting between his partner and the woman now struggling to stay conscious. His badge felt heavier than it ever had. Maybe it was the weight of witnessing a crime, or the sudden realization that the oath he swore had already been compromised. Rob Pulaski, for his part, stared at the gun in his hand as if someone else had pulled the trigger. That was always the trick with men like him. Violence wasn't a failure. It was instinct, and the only surprise was that someone important got hit. You could almost hear the panic creak behind his sweat-streaked brow. What the hell did I just do? What he did, in fact, was shoot the state attorney general of New York like she was some shoplifter who reached too fast. And now that he realized it, the show began. The Pulaski Protocol. Panic, deny, distort, and decorate the scene with lies like dollar store garlands. Pulaski scanned the area, frantic. He didn't look for help. He looked for props. A stick? A crushed beer can? A goddamn paperclip would have sufficed if it vaguely resembled a threat. That's the beautiful efficiency of institutional cover. The lie only has to be possible, not believable. Come on, he muttered under his breath, half to himself, half to a universe that had finally stopped indulging him. Meanwhile, windows creaked open. Blinds shifted. The neighborhood, quiet just seconds ago, began to stir with stunned witnesses. Phones rose like antennas of outrage. Someone shouted, "Did he just shoot her?" Another yelled, "Call an ambulance now." Voices carried. Truth began leaking from doorways and porches before Pulaski could smear it with blue ink lies. Kevin Chen hadn't moved an inch. Pulaski turned toward him with the wild eyes of a cornered animal. "You didn't see anything," he snarled. "You hear me?" She was aggressive, non-compliant. "Say it." Chen blinked. He looked down at Letitia, one hand now pressed weakly against her wound. She was still breathing, but just barely. Her fingers were trembling, not from fear but from blood loss and the cruel math of proximity to a man with a badge and no moral compass. "Say it," Pulaski growled again, louder this time. But what was Kevin supposed to say? That she lunged, that she reached for something, that she was threatening a man half her IQ and twice her ego? How do you write that in a report in sleep? Letitia let out a faint sound. A cough, maybe, or a laugh. It was hard to tell. Blood bubbled at her lips. "I didn't even move," she whispered, her voice sandpaper soft but sharper than any indictment. "All I asked was why." Chen's eyes met hers, and in that moment, something cracked. Not in the air, but inside him. He had signed up to serve, not to stand silent. But here he was, second officer on the scene of a modern lynching in a pressed blue uniform, a junior partner in a tragedy of arrogance and fear. Pulaski was pacing now, jittery. "I can fix this," he muttered. "We'll say she was reaching. No body cam, no problem. These people, this is how they act. Don't be naive, Chen." "These people?" Kevin finally spoke, his voice quieter than he expected, but laced with something unfamiliar. Contempt. Pulaski whipped around. "Yeah, these people. You'll learn. Keep your mouth shut, rookie. You want a career?" Chen didn't answer, but for the first time, he looked less like a rookie and more like a witness. Across the street, sirens began to rise. A second squad car, an ambulance, lights flickering against brick walls. Pulaski adjusted his stance. His face changed. It was the shift of a seasoned liar. His hands shook, but not with remorse, with calculation. He needed to control the narrative before the medics and supervisors arrived. Before Letitia James could speak, before anyone could remember that, despite not wearing a uniform, she was the law. Pulaski wiped his brow, tucked his Glock back into its holster, and stood over the woman he had just gunned down, rehearsing his lines. She was hostile. She refused. She reached. But the growing crowd, the glint of phones, the stain spreading under Letitia, none of it seemed to agree. And somewhere inside Kevin Chen, buried beneath the protocols and training manuals, a thought bloomed with disturbing clarity. This isn't law enforcement. This is theater. And today, I'm standing on the wrong stage. The real question now was, how long could Pulaski keep the curtain from falling? And what would Kevin do when the spotlight turned his way? Pulaski didn't waste a second. With the cool detachment of a man who's rehearsed disaster, he snapped into his next role, victim. She was aggressive, he barked at dispatch, refused to comply, reached for something, could have been a weapon. I feared for my life. The classic trifecta: resistance, mystery object, mortal danger. A well-worn script, dog-eared from decades of misuse, trotted out like a carnival trick on command. No emotion, no hesitation. Just muscle memory from a department that had long stopped asking questions and started filing answers in advance. Kevin Chen, still pale as concrete, nodded without meaning to. His mouth didn't move, his mind didn't process, but his body, trained to obey, trained to defer, gave a single pathetic nod as the ambulance screamed to a halt. Letitia James, once hailed as the state's unshakable legal bulldog, was now slipping into unconsciousness under a hot sun, her blood leaving a trail on the sidewalk like some tragic punctuation. Two EMTs rushed forward, their gloves snapping, voices urgent but grim. One bent over Letitia and swore under his breath. "No exit wound," he muttered. "She's bleeding internally. Prep her for trauma surgery. Stat." As they loaded her onto the gurney, Pulaski didn't flinch. He didn't help. He didn't even look particularly concerned. He watched like a man watching a raccoon get scooped off a porch, mildly inconvenienced, vaguely annoyed, entirely disconnected. Then he turned to Chen and, with an air of forced brotherhood, spat, "We're covered. Just stick to the report. We both know what she looked like. The brass won't ask too many questions. We both know what she looked like. Not who she was, not what she did, not the office she held, the cases she argued, or the lives she changed. Just what she looked like. That sentence alone should be engraved on the tombstone of moral credibility in half the precincts of America." On the ride back to the precinct, Pulaski leaned back like he had just wrapped up a traffic citation, not a near-fatal shooting. "She had that vibe, you know?" he said casually, like he was talking about bad sushi. "All attitude, no humility. You can spot 'em a mile away. Think they're better than you. You saw how she talked, like I owed her an explanation." Chen didn't reply. His hands were clenched in his lap, damp with sweat. He stared at them, two hands that had once shaken his mother's with pride the day he graduated from the academy, hands that had lifted his badge like a promise. Now they felt alien, filthy, as if the blood from Letitia's shirt had soaked into his skin through proximity. When they pulled into the lot, Pulaski straightened his uniform, gave a little cough, and turned to his partner. "Say it again so you get used to it." She reached. "I feared for my life." "Come on." Chen looked out the window. Silence. "You want to make it in this department," Pulaski continued. "You have to know when to keep your mouth shut and protect your own. That's how it works, rookie. Don't go soft on me. You think internal affairs is going to have your back? You think the brass will cover you if you screw this up? We're the only line between chaos and order." What Pulaski called order sounded suspiciously like theater with loaded weapons. Upstairs, the paperwork began. Pulaski filled out his use of force report with the ease of a man who knew which buzzwords pushed which bureaucratic buttons. Suspect exhibited erratic behavior, verbal non-compliance, quick movement, officer safety concerns. He practically wrote it in crayon. By the time he hit submit, the fiction was in motion, one more entry in the ever-growing ledger of institutional storytelling, a ledger so bloated with myth it could qualify as fantasy literature. Back in the patrol car, Kevin Chen still hadn't exited. The precinct building loomed ahead like a monument to all the compromises he hadn't realized he'd already made. He stared through the windshield, unblinking, lost in the looping memory of a single moment. Letitia's voice, blood pooling, her lips barely moving. All I asked was why. It was the first time Kevin had felt truly dirty in uniform. Not from sweat, not from grime, but from silence, from knowing the truth and choosing cowardice, from watching a lie get drafted in real time and doing nothing but exist beside it. And now, the lie was officially logged, time-stamped, and signed. But what Pulaski hadn't counted on, what he never factored into his playbook, was the danger of a witness who remembers everything, especially when the truth itches beneath the skin like poison. So while Pulaski leaned back at his desk, sipping vending machine coffee and waiting for the brass to pat his back for handling a hostel, Chen sat in the patrol car, wondering how long before his conscience exploded, and what would happen when it did. Letitia James didn't come from money. She came from Brooklyn. Not the gentrified brunch and bagels version, but the real Brooklyn. Raised in a modest home by working-class parents who believed in God, grit, and public libraries. Her mother worked nights. Her father, a Vietnam veteran, knew how to keep food on the table and trouble off it. There was no silver spoon, no Ivy League legacy, just relentless discipline, an oversized sense of justice, and a teenage Letitia who once checked out To Kill a Mockingbird so many times the librarian gave her the copy to keep. She didn't just claw her way into politics, she bulldozed through it. A JD from Howard, years in the trenches as a public defender, a seat on city council, and eventually the title that made her enemies gulp, Attorney General of New York. She sued crooked landlords, dismantled corporate fraud, and filed lawsuits so clean they made Wall Street sweat like a nun in Vegas. When the opioid kings came knocking, she knocked harder. When governors overstepped, she stepped in. Letitia James became the woman you did not want asking questions, unless you had your tax records laminated and your conscience bleached. And yet, on a street she once walked as a kid, dressed like any other New Yorker trying to buy groceries, she was shot by a man who saw none of it. To Officer Rob Pulaski, she was just another black woman who dared to speak with authority. Let's talk about Rob. Officer Robert Rob Pulaski, on paper, had 15 years of service. In reality, he was a walking HR violation dressed like a cop. His personnel file looked like a bingo card of misconduct. Excessive force complaints, racially charged outbursts, disciplinary recommendations that never translated into action. Pulaski didn't patrol neighborhoods. He haunted them. Ask around and you'd hear whispers, especially from people of color, of the red-faced guy who escalated parking stops into shouting matches and always seemed 2 decibels away from a taser. The department knew. They always know. But Pulaski was protected by the holy trinity of police inertia: seniority, silence, and an overpaid union lawyer. He called suspects animals in casual conversation, referred to neighborhoods as zones, and treated every question like an insult. Internal Affairs had reviewed him 3 times. Each time the conclusion was the same: insufficient evidence. Translation: nobody wants the paperwork. His colleagues didn't like him, but they tolerated him. Like a gas leak you hope someone else reports first. And now, thanks to 15 years of avoided accountability and 1 trigger-happy afternoon, Rob Pulaski had managed to do the impossible. He'd shot one of the most powerful legal figures in the state and was still filing paperwork like he misplaced a stapler. As for Kevin Chen, the rookie, fresh out of the academy with pristine shoes and a mind full of procedural ethics, he had been partnered with Pulaski 3 months earlier, a warm welcome from a department that enjoyed breaking rookies like bad shoes. Kevin was idealistic, maybe even naive. He believed that law enforcement was about protecting people, not punishing them for existing. But ride along with Rob for a few shifts, and you learned fast that protect and serve had fine print. You learned that suspicion had a skin tone, that silence was safer than dissent, and that objectivity was a luxury you couldn't afford if you wanted to keep your locker untouched. Chen had watched Pulaski hurl slurs under his breath. He'd seen him shove a teenager for attitude. He'd been told to lighten up when he raised concerns, and now, after a gunshot and a lie typed in all caps, he was realizing that silence wasn't neutral. It was consent. "You're soft," Pulaski once told him over lunch. "This job isn't for boys with poetry degrees and mommy issues. You want to survive? You learn who's who. You watch their hands and you ignore their mouths." But Kevin Chen remembered Letitia's mouth, her words, her tone, her calm. "Is there a reason I'm being stopped?" she had asked. That's it. That was her crime. and now she was somewhere between surgery and a coma while Pulaski sat 3 desks over from a vending machine pretending he was the victim. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. 1. A self-made civil servant with a resume carved from steel and stone. The other, a ticking time bomb with a badge and a god complex. And the third, a young man trapped between 2 versions of justice, the one he'd trained for and the one he was complicit in. As the hours passed, the precinct moved like nothing had happened. Phones rang, reports stacked, officers joked. Pulaski leaned back in his chair like he'd just written someone a speeding ticket instead of shooting a public official. But Kevin Chen wasn't laughing. He was staring at the clock, and for the first time, he was counting down. Not toward the end of his shift, but toward the beginning of his reckoning. By the time the last staple hit Pulaski's falsified incident report, the news had already metastasized. Letitia James, New York Attorney General, shot by police during routine traffic stop. A headline so grotesque it sounded like a parody, like something you'd read in The Onion if The Onion lost all sense of humor. But there it was, churning through phones, popping up on lock screens, scrolling across news tickers with the cold urgency of a national hemorrhage. At 2:47 p.m., Letitia was unconscious on an operating table. At 3:09, the New York Times had their third source. By 4 o'clock, dash as justice. For Letitia had hit the trending bar harder than any Kardashian divorce. It didn't take long for the optics to implode. The image of a black woman, not just any woman, but the state's top legal officer, laid out in a trauma bay because Officer Rob Pulaski decided her voice was too confident? That wasn't just an incident. That was a declaration. A flashing neon sign that read, "No title can outrank your skin." The backlash wasn't organized, it was instinctual. The black community didn't need a memo or a manifesto. They just saw the name Letitia paired with the words "shot by police" and knew exactly what kind of story this was. The kind that starts with a routine stop and ends with someone fighting for their life while the shooter clocks overtime. Lawyers posted full statements in black and white graphics within the hour, as if the industry had a folder titled Injustice.psd ready to drop. Bar associations, human rights councils, even 3 Supreme Court clerks issued public statements. Because apparently, watching the chief legal officer of a major state get gunned down while asking a question was a bridge too far, even for the apathy-inflated American palate. The military, usually slow to dip its toes into domestic messes, didn't flinch this time. Why? Because Letitia James wasn't just any civilian. She had deep working ties with military legal affairs, had fought corruption within contracting chains, had personally helped draft veteran advocacy reforms. She was known at the Pentagon, not as some symbolic guest, but as a peer. And now she was in the ICU with a ventilator tube down her throat because Officer Pulaski had the emotional restraint of a bar bouncer on Red Bull. It took only one call from a senior JAG officer to trigger the protocol. CID, the U.S. Army's Criminal Investigation Division, deployed a special team within hours. They didn't come to assist. They came to supervise, to remind local law enforcement that this time, the body on the pavement wasn't just a number, it was ranked. Meanwhile, the White House, alerted via an emergency briefing from the DOJ, did what the White House always does in moments of catastrophe: schedule a press conference to say absolutely nothing, cautiously. The statement was boilerplate. "We are deeply concerned. We urge calm. We will monitor the investigation." Translation: "We're not touching this until the polls come in." Back in New York, The streets began to fill. First came the quiet ones, the aunties with folding chairs, the grandmothers in sandals clutching laminated photos of Letitia with the mayor at some forgotten ribbon cutting. Then came the activists with megaphones, the lawyers in suits, the veterans with medals pinned to faded jackets. A protester shouted into a mic, "If Letitia James isn't safe from police violence, who the hell is?" Another held up a cardboard sign. "You don't shoot corruption. You sue it, unless you're scared it might sue back." As dusk fell, the hospital lawn became a vigil of outrage. Candles flickered beside phone chargers. Names were chanted. Speeches were live-streamed. Letitia's image glowed on thousands of screens, head high, eyes unflinching, as if daring America to blink first. Meanwhile, Pulaski still hadn't been arrested. He was on administrative leave, which in American policing means go home, mow your lawn, and wait for the union to draft your defense. But the problem was, this time the system shot someone who was the system. And across town, in a windowless CID war room, agents with military clearance were pinning photos, cross-referencing call logs, dissecting body cam metadata, and asking the one question Rob Pulaski had never once bothered to ask. Why? And if Pulaski thought the uniform would protect him from scrutiny, he was about to find out what happens when that same uniform decides it won't protect him from truth. The CID team didn't show up in blue. They showed up in black suits and clipped syllables, armed with legal authority and military detachment. No fanfare, no press, no donuts. They didn't need local cooperation. They needed local containment. And make no mistake, they weren't there to assist the NYPD. They were there because they knew the NYPD would circle the wagons, polish the shield, and try, one more time, to bury the truth under a mountain of procedure and plausible deniability. The team was led by a no-nonsense investigator named Major Daniels, whose idea of small talk was a constitutional citation. "I'm not here to play interagency politics," she told the first brass-shirted NYPD supervisor who tried to stonewall. "I'm here because someone shot a decorated public official and then filed paperwork like they ordered a pizza." Her team got to work within minutes. They didn't start with Pulaski's statement, because they knew better than to start with fiction. They started with data. Doorbell cams, security footage from corner bodegas, eyewitness interviews scrubbed for rehearsed parroting. They triangulated angles like mathematicians on caffeine. Every frame told the same story. Letitia exited her vehicle calmly, hands raised, expression neutral. She posed no threat, no sudden movements, just a question. Then one shot, center mass, then collapse. There were no weapons found in her car. Not a blade, not a screwdriver, not so much as a nail file. Her glove compartment contained only registration papers, a lip balm, and a receipt from a neighborhood bookstore. Some threat. But what caught CID's attention more than the gunshot was the man who didn't move at all. Kevin Chen. There he was, frozen in time on at least 3 angles of footage. Mouth slightly open, face slack, hands limp at his sides as Letitia hit the pavement. CID analysts replayed the clip like a Rosetta Stone for cowardice. That stillness said everything. He wasn't reaching for his gun. He wasn't reacting to danger. He wasn't doing anything, because there was nothing to react to. Chen had the look of a man watching his soul step outside his body, shake its head, and walk away. Major Daniels called him in. No threats, no shouting, just one razor-sharp offer. "Officer Chen, you have a choice. You can help us restore credibility, or be remembered as the man who watched truth bleed out and did nothing." Chen sat across from her, hands folded, still in uniform that felt more like a costume by the minute. Daniels continued, tone clinical. We have 6 eyewitnesses, 3 security feeds, ballistic reports, and 0 evidence of a weapon. What we don't have yet is a second officer's account. That's where you come in. He said, Chen stammered, already cracking under the weight of proximity to the lie. I don't care what he said, Daniels cut in. I care what you saw, and based on your reaction in the footage, I'd say your eyes told the truth even if your mouth didn't. Chen shifted in his chair. You don't understand the pressure. He's been in the department 15 years. Everyone listens to him. Daniels didn't blink. 15 years of garbage doesn't make him a leader. It makes him a liability with seniority. You weren't there, Chen pushed back. It all happened so fast. I just froze. You didn't freeze, Daniels said. You watched. You watched a colleague fire a round into an unarmed civilian, and you stood still. That's not freezing. That's deciding. Chen's silence screamed louder than any siren. Daniels leaned forward, softening. Just barely. Look, I'm not here to ruin your life, but you need to decide which side of the table you're going to sit on. Right now, Pulaski's narrative is cracking like bad glass, and when it shatters, you don't want to be holding a shard. Chen looked up slowly. If I talk, I'll be blacklisted. I'll lose everything. Daniels nodded. Or you'll sleep again. Your call. Outside the door, CID techs were piecing together timelines with surgical precision. One analyst chuckled bitterly as he played Pulaski's radio call next to the footage. Listen to this. She lunged at me, while she's literally standing still. He could have at least matched the timing. The lies weren't just lazy. They were insulting. But the truth had teeth. It was crawling out of emails, timestamps, tire tracks, and video files. And the deeper CID dug, the more the truth looked less like a misfire and more like what it truly was. A weaponized assumption, wrapped in blue. And Kevin Chen? He was running out of time to decide whether his uniform still represented public safety or just protected public liars. What he said next would either seal a narrative or shatter it. And CID? They were sharpening every piece. Kevin Chen stopped sleeping. Not the kind of insomnia you cure with herbal tea and guided meditation, but the kind where your conscience screams so loud that even silence becomes unbearable. His eyes hollowed out like someone had scraped his ideals clean, and every time he passed Pulaski in the hallway, his stomach twisted with a guilt so physical it could have been mistaken for food poisoning. Except food poisoning eventually passes. This didn't. Pulaski, ever the sociopath in a windbreaker, kept up his usual routine. He whistled. He cracked jokes in the locker room. He slapped Chen on the back like they'd won a game. Told you, kid, he'd say with a smirk. Storm'll pass. It always does. Just keep your head down and your mouth shut. This ain't your fight. Except it was his fight, and the storm wasn't passing. It was intensifying. At home, Kevin's parents noticed the change. His mother, who once beamed with pride at her son in uniform, now stared at him with quiet, aching questions in her eyes. His father, a first-generation immigrant who ran a small grocery store and still referred to America as the land of accountability, sat him down one night and didn't mince words. You are not protecting anyone, he said, voice low and tight. You are hiding. There is a difference. Chen looked away, but his father wasn't finished. You think silence will save your job? Maybe it will, but it will not save your name. One day, your children will ask what you did when a woman was shot for asking a question. And what will you say? That you were scared? I was scared, Kevin snapped. Then imagine how she felt, his father shot back. And she still stood. Can you say the same? That was the breaking point. Not the footage, not the CID cross-examinations, not even the late-night panic attacks. It was the unbearable simplicity of that truth. Kevin Chen walked into CID headquarters 2 days later looking like a man on the edge of confession, or collapse. Major Daniels barely looked up. "You here to tell the truth?" she asked flatly. "Or buy time?" He sat down. "I'm ready to tell everything." And he did. He confessed that Pulaski had no probable cause to stop Letitia James, that there was no erratic driving, no matching description, no suspicious behavior, just a woman, alone, driving a nice car in a zip code Pulaski deemed suspicious by skin tone alone. He didn't even run her plates, Chen admitted. He just said, "She looks like trouble." That was it. Daniels asked, "Did you object?" "I hesitated," Chen said, eyes wet but steady, "and then I stayed quiet." He detailed how Letitia exited the vehicle peacefully, raised her hands and asked a single reasonable question. How Pulaski snapped, not from fear, but from wounded ego. How he drew his weapon with the deliberation of a man who'd been waiting for an excuse. "He didn't flinch," Chen whispered. "It wasn't panic. It was intent." Daniels leaned forward. "And after the shot?" Chen didn't blink. "He told me to lie. He said, say she resisted, say she reached, say she looked aggressive." "And did you?" "Yes, I repeated it. At first, I was afraid. Of him, of the department, of being the one who broke the wall." Daniels nodded slowly, the weight of the confession sinking between them like stone. "But now?" "I'd rather lose my badge than my soul," Chen said. That sentence, simple, human, imperfect, became the turning point in the entire case. Because while Pulaski strutted around like a man unburdened by morality, his partner had just flipped the table. CID agents documented every word, every pause, every tremor. They didn't need embellishment. Chen's testimony was a sledgehammer to Pulaski's house of lies, and it came from the one person who had been close enough to smell the gunpowder. Outside the CID building, the press hadn't yet caught wind, but the wheels were already turning. The moment the transcript was filed, the lie that Letitia James posed a threat became not just weak, it became impossible. And now, all that remained was what would come next. A warrant, a perp walk, and the long, humiliating collapse of a man who thought his badge was a shield against truth. The arrest came just after midnight. No sirens, no grand theatrics. Just a quiet knock on the side entrance of the NYPD's 48th precinct, followed by a moment that would be replayed across every American news network by breakfast. Detective Rob Pulaski, handcuffed, flanked by federal agents, and caught squinting into the brutal honesty of camera flashes. His expression? Not rage, not defiance, just the unmistakable panic of a man who spent his career barking orders and now had no one left to bark at. It turns out the hardest sound for bullies to process isn't opposition, it's silence. And when Pulaski heard his Miranda rights, the room was dead quiet. The charges read like the full menu of American accountability, usually reserved for civilian defendants without badges or pensions. But this time, justice skipped the euphemisms. Aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, abuse of power, falsification of a police report, hate crime enhancement. A mouthful of reality Pulaski could neither spell nor outrun. His perp walk was a buffet for the press. They lined the barricades like paparazzi at a fallen celebrity's premiere, only this time no stylists, no publicist, no exit strategy, just shame in uniform. One reporter even called out, "Officer Pulaski, was she threatening you with logic or just her skin tone?" Another shouted, "Still feel like a hero, Rob?" The man who once strutted through neighborhoods with a hand glued to his holster now flinched under questions, shielded his eyes, and muttered something unintelligible that will no doubt later be labeled as taken out of context. But context was exactly what he'd lost. The public response was volcanic. Twitter combusted. Cable news anchors abandoned their scripts and leaned into the moment like priests at an exorcism. Pundits left and right, many of whom couldn't spell systemic last week, suddenly became experts on use of force policy. The phrase, "another George Floyd," trended within hours, except this time it came with a twist of institutional irony. The victim was the damn Attorney General. Letitia James wasn't just another face. She was the system Pulaski claimed to serve. She was order. She was law. And for all the badges and bureaucrats who had insisted that good guys with guns protect the fabric of democracy, Pulaski had torn it with a single shot. In a sterile ICU room uptown, Letitia James opened her eyes for the first time in days. Her body, battered and stapled back together by 3 back-to-back surgeries, barely moved. But her mind? Razor sharp. The nurse whispered gently, "They arrested him." Letitia didn't speak. She didn't smile. She just nodded once. Slow, measured, regal, like a judge delivering a sentence with her chin. That nod traveled farther than any press release. It became a meme, a gif, a symbol. That single motion, dignified, restrained, yet dripping with vindication, sent a message louder than any speech she could have delivered. I'm still here. And justice just found its footing. It didn't take long for social media to immortalize the moment. One post read, "They tried to silence a voice, and now she's the anthem." Another, "Pulaski got cuffed. Letitia got history." Meanwhile, back in holding, Pulaski wasn't doing so well. Turns out the man who once swaggered through minority neighborhoods like a discount John Wayne had a hard time adjusting to stainless steel benches and interrogators who didn't fear his resume. His lawyer, a panic hiring from a union pool, tried floating the defense of split-second decision. But even he winced as he said it, like chewing on glass dipped in bleach. But this wasn't about one man anymore. Pulaski was no longer a person. He was a mirror, a cracked, arrogant, sweating mirror reflecting every unpunished abuse, every racially coded stop, every weaponized glance, and every report typed in past tense fiction. And now the mirror was on trial. The system, for once, didn't circle the wagons. It dragged them into court. And as the nation watched, jaws clenched and fists ready, one question hung in the air like a verdict waiting to be read. Would justice finally finish what Letitia's blood had started? It wasn't just a trial. It was a national reckoning dressed in a federal courtroom. The line to get into the gallery snaked around the block like concert-goers waiting for a comeback tour. Only this wasn't rock and roll. This was justice, finally walking on stage with receipts, affidavits, and a body count. By 9 a.m., the federal courthouse looked more like a civic cathedral. Camera crews jockeyed for position, protesters held laminated signs that hadn't wilted in 3 weeks, and inside, pews were packed not with parishioners but with lawyers, veterans, activists, law students, and every civil servant who ever wondered whether the system actually had a backbone. Rob Pulaski sat at the defendant's table in a bland gray suit, trying desperately to look like someone who hadn't once referred to community policing as babysitting the jungle. His expression was a mix of bored defiance and bad Botox, and every now and then he scribbled on a legal pad like a man who still believed the outcome could be spun. His defense team wore matching grimaces, flipping through binders like they might find something useful wedged between lunch receipts and thin excuses. The prosecution, on the other hand, came armed for war. They opened with footage. Letitia James, calm, composed, hands raised, asking a question. Then population. Then pavement. The courtroom didn't gasp. They'd already seen the video. What followed wasn't revelation. It was confirmation, and it landed with the weight of a closing fist. Kevin Chen took the stand next, and if Pulaski's stomach churned, he didn't show it. But his jaw clenched. His eye twitched. His entire posture screamed, "Traitor!" And Chen? He didn't flinch. "I joined this department to protect people," Chen said evenly. But what I saw that day wasn't protection. It was targeted violence. It was rage wrapped in a badge. He recounted everything. The unjustified stop, Pulaski's racial epithets, the warning to lie or face consequences, his own cowardice, his own shame, and finally, the moment he decided that wearing the truth on his chest was more important than wearing a patch on his sleeve. Pulaski's lawyer tried to rattle him. "Officer Chen, are you here under pressure from your new friends in CID?" "No," Chen replied calmly. "I'm here because I watched a colleague shoot an unarmed woman for daring to ask why, and for weeks I lived with that silence. This is me ending it." The jury stared. Some scribbled notes. One just stared at Pulaski, expression hardening by the second. Then, Letitia entered. Wheeled into the courtroom by her sister, dressed in a simple navy blazer and still visibly weak, Letitia James didn't need a grand speech. She didn't need a sermon. Her presence was indictment enough. When she locked eyes with Pulaski across the aisle, he looked down. Not in respect, but in the unmistakable posture of a man remembering every word he ever muttered under his breath. The prosecution rested on the unshakable trifecta: body cam blackouts, falsified reports, and medical records proving the bullet's trajectory matched Letitia's stance, arms raised, torso still. One pathologist even dryly noted, "It's anatomically impossible for the victim to have lunged, as claimed, without first bending the laws of physics." The defense stumbled through procedural jargon, theories of miscommunication, the ever-popular split-second decision, crutch. They tried to paint Pulaski as overworked, overstressed, conditioned by years on the force. But no amount of bureaucratic hand-waving could erase the fact that their client had fired at a woman whose only crime was challenging his entitlement. And when the verdict came, it didn't come with fanfare. It came with the chilling stillness of inevitability. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom didn't erupt. It exhaled. Letitia closed her eyes briefly. No tears. Just breathe. Just survival. Just proof that sometimes the system actually works. Not because it wants to, but because someone forced it to. And Pulaski? He sat there blinking, stunned, as if still convinced the uniform he used to wear had some sort of divine immunity clause. But even the bench didn't blink. "Mr. Pulaski," the judge said, his voice surgical, "this was not a mistake. It was a decision. And today we return the favor." The sentence would come next, and with it, the final humiliation. But for now, as the courtroom emptied and the headlines typed themselves, one thing was clear. Letitia James had been silenced at gunpoint, and still found a way to have the last word. Rob Pulaski got 35 years in federal prison. Not the country club minimum security fantasy that bad cops whisper about over watered-down coffee, but the real deal. Concrete, barbed wire, and the sound of your own thoughts echoing off cinder-block walls. And while he sat through sentencing with that same smug squint he wore when shooting down complaints in internal review meetings, the judge made sure his last shred of swagger didn't walk out with him. This wasn't a lapse in judgment, the ruling read. It was the calculated use of violence to silence dignity. The cherry on top? A court-ordered payment of $55,000 in restitution to Letitia James, an insultingly small amount for trying to erase a life, but a legally binding reminder that even systems built on power sometimes write checks on behalf of shame. And the NYPD? Oh, they didn't get off with a press release and a 3-day training webinar. The Department of Justice moved in like a new landlord with a long list of violations. Mandatory bias re-education, federal oversight, top-down audits. They renamed it reform, but behind closed doors it felt more like a controlled demolition. Every captain with a drawer full of ignored complaints suddenly found themselves being re-evaluated. Entire precincts were told to relearn the Constitution, starting with Amendment 1, just in case they'd forgotten that asking why isn't probable cause. As for Kevin Chen, the department cut him loose within 48 hours of the verdict. Not with a ceremony, not even a proper sit-down. Just a signature and a cold nod from a deputy commissioner who probably still couldn't pronounce his last name correctly. But unlike his partner, Chen walked out of the system with something Pulaski never earned, a measure of redemption. He wasn't hailed as a hero, nor should he have been, but he became a cautionary tale with a second chapter. The kid who waited too long to speak, but eventually chose the truth over his pension. That's not courage, it's clarity delayed. But in this broken machine, even that counts as rare currency. Letitia James, meanwhile, didn't just survive. She redefined the entire narrative. Once known as a ferocious watchdog for justice, she now stood as something larger, a living rebuke to every smug voice that claimed systemic abuse was a myth. Her recovery was slow. The scars didn't fade, but her first public appearance post-trial was broadcast live across every major network. Rolled onto the stage in a wheelchair, draped in navy blue, she paused before speaking, long enough for the nation to realize that silence, in her case, was no longer a wound. It was a weapon. I've faced dictators in suits, corporations in denial, and backroom deals with too many zeros, she began, her voice calm, low, unmistakable. But nothing prepared me for a bullet fired by a man who thought a badge made him a god. She looked directly into the camera. Let me be clear. No badge stands above the law. No skin tone justifies a trigger. And no system gets to call itself fair while its silence bleeds the loudest. The quote burned across social media. One banner summed it up perfectly. No badge stands above justice. No skin tone deserves a gun barrel. Schools printed it on posters. Protesters inked it onto cardboard. Even a retired judge in Illinois had it framed in his office. Because it wasn't just about Letitia anymore. It was about a country forced to look in the mirror and ask itself the very question she once asked on the side of a sun-scorched New York street. Is there a reason I'm being stopped? The answer, finally, was yes. But this time it wasn't her on trial. It was the mirror. And this time it cracked,